So hello and welcome to this, our fifth ramble around the churchyard of St Nicholas in Sutton. Hello and welcome. This is a lovely day. I'm looking outside the window and it is gorgeous sunshine. I'm Jeff Richards and I'm taking you on this ramble round the churchyard because I'm a trustee of the Friends of St Nicholas Churchyard, and this is one of our regular virtual rambles through the churchyard. St Nicholas is the ancient parish church of Sutton, and it's very much at the heart of Sutton. This photo, and let me just share out the next photo on here. Let's actually see where we go on here. Let's see. This is a photo from the fabulous Peter Struick. He's managed to capture really quite some of the striking architecture of the church, and I'm very grateful for the volunteers of the Churchyard group who take photos and share things and then suggest as well interesting topics like this. In fact, we started these sessions very much because of the frustration that we all face in not being able to meet up in person, and the need, of course, to stay at home, protect the NHS and to save lives. So we've got a historic moment that allows us to look at history together. So let's do that. Let's take advantage of the historic moment. I need to make sure that my slides are moving on at the right space, and here they are. We're looking at the next slide, which is just reminding us that we're not alone in terms of the groups that love and support Sutton. And I'm very pleased that these little rambles have attracted the encouragement and support of Enjoy Sutton and Sutton Civic Society, and that's fantastic. So I'm very grateful that Enjoy Sutton are on board. They are, in fact, it's an organisation that brings together, think about the High Street area of Sutton. That's over 500 businesses and voluntary groups and community groups and organisations using the High Street. We want to be able to celebrate all those different organisations who make for a great town centre. And then we've got the Sutton Civic Society as well, which is a membership group which lobbies and works to try and build up civic pride within Sutton, and also to look at being a critical friend to try and improve the progress that is being made in the development of buildings and architecture within Sutton. This week I'm exploring this gentleman. Well, I'm not exploring this gentleman, I'm exploring this gentleman's life. And this is Sir Richard Mason, who you may know was the Lord of the Manor in the period up to the Glorious Revolution. So he was very much in that time frame that we saw a radical change in our country's constitution and in the arrangement of really the way in which we do politics today. There's a lot of roots in that 17th century period, which we can call the early modern period, which really did shape the society in which we live. So this topic was suggested by Mr. John Kerr. He's one of the church wardens of St Nicholas, and actually he wanted me to talk about Anne, Richard Mason's daughter, who got up to some naughty shenanigans and had a scandalous life, but telling Anne's story without putting it into the context of her family story doesn't make much sense. So we're starting off here looking at Sir Richard Mason, and actually properly the history starts with this man. And this man, of course, you'll recognise probably as Charles I, King Charles I. This was the king who, during his reign, saw our country convulsed by civil war. The war started in 1642 when our Richard Mason was a mere lad of 9 years old. His family actually had their property, their family wealth within King's Clear in Hampshire. They weren't a particularly prominent family. but they were adherents to the king's cause, and that's an important thing. But unfortunately, we know that history didn't work out terribly well for King Charles I. First of all, he lost too much support, then he lost too many battles, and finally he lost his head. And Charles was executed on a chilly 29th of January in 1649. I had to look then. I had to remember I couldn't quite remember then. But Richard Mason would have been 16 years old, and 16 years old placed him well into the category of military service. As somebody from gentry, he would have been thought of as old enough to take part in combat, and he would have wanted to take part in combat. But this would have been a period of anxiety and danger for his family. Now, locally within Sutton, Richard is still living here in Hampshire with his family, but Sutton, there was a lot of civil division. So the villages of Cheam, Sutton, Carshalton and Beddington are all 12 miles away from London. So on horseback, that's a really easy commute. You can get to it very, very easily. And during the 17th century, the merchant class of London, with all of their political radicalism, became involved in Surrey politics as well. And this image happens to be a detail from the monument to... it's a monument inside St. Nicholas. Actually, it's in a broom cupboard inside St. Nicholas that is dedicated to Sarah Glover, who is the wife of the Puritan... rector of Sutton, Jose Glover. It's sometimes Joss Glover. He's never called Joseph Glover. He wasn't Joseph. He was Jos Glover. And Jos Glover, the significant thing about Jos Glover is that he was a Puritan, and when we mean Puritan, his wife, this lady here, Sarah Glover, her relatives were prominent in Surrey. They actually include in her relatives a regicide, somebody who signed the death warrant of the king, and Jos Glover himself really was of the type of carpet chewing religious enthusiast who really did divide opinion. He'd got into trouble with royal authorities when he'd refused to follow instructions and read the king's order permitting the playing of games on Sunday. That's called the King's Book of Sports. That was in 1633. He finally gave up on England and pushed off to Massachusetts, where he took the printing press. But that's getting into another story. So let's get back into our main story, which is really thinking about what happened when Charles I got his head chopped off. This is a depiction of Nonsuch Palace. You know that Nonsuch Palace was in beyond Cheam, in what was the old manor of Cuddington, completely destroyed as Nonsuch was built. After the king got his head cut off, really Nonsuch Palace was seized along with all of the other royal properties. But in the case of Nonsuch, it was really quite sad because it was seized by the parliamentary forces and not treated well at all. You've got the clergy of Cheam, Sutton, and Carshalton. They'd all been in place before the Civil War started. So they were all, you could think of them as sound people from a king's perspective, and they all had a hard time of it. There's different stories about what happened to people like Henry Witch, who was the rector of Sutton, during the Civil War, and what happened to, I think it was the rector of Cheam and the rector of Carshalton, the vicar of Carshalton, who really did have a rough time during the Civil War, all the while trying to maintain a semblance of stable religious life. Now this was really in the period of the protectorate. This is Oliver Cromwell, this photo, when government was little more than a dictatorship underneath Cromwell. And Cromwell couldn't actually get a government to properly function. He kept on calling and dismissing Parliament. He couldn't get ministers to stick and do their job. It was the centre, because they'd cut the king's head off. What was holding the country together was lost, and Cromwell was only able to really get government to have any semblance of function through his force of personality and the discipline of the army who imposing order. And in Sutton, we've got chunks missing from the parish registers where pages have just been cut out or partly torn, partly removed, cut very carefully out, removed, and they were done to protect people, and largely done by the rector of Sutton, Henry Witch. It got really bad during the Protectorate period. That was a period of 1653 to 1659. But really, by 1660, the steam had run out of the Protectorate. Cromwell had tried, as he was approaching death, to pass on his authority to his son, and his son is Richard Cromwell, but unfortunately his little Dick was not up to the task of government, and the army generals decided it was time to end the Republican experiment and to bring back the monarchy. So here we have Charles II being brought back onto the throne. And that's where we can really bring Sir Richard into the foreground again as well. So Richard comes back into our story. He's 27. That's more or less the same age as Charles Stuart, who's 3 years older than him. So he's a 27-year-old man coming in. He's a proven royalist. You've got Charles II coming onto the throne. He's 30, so they're both relatively young men. They're of the same generation. And this was an excellent time for Sir Richard to really show his ambition and to develop his career within royal service. And 2 years after the Restoration, Sir Richard married, and he was 29 when he got married, and which is the average age, actually, for anyone to marry in the later part of the 17th century. And the lady he married was a lady called Anne Margaret Long, who was the daughter of Sir James Long, who was a English politician and royalist. So in allowing Sir Richard to marry his daughter, our Richard must have been the right type of person, really a solid chap in Sir James's eyes. And well, Sir James is interesting because he was a magistrate even during the Civil War period. So in the parts of the country that were underneath royal authority, he was able to do his duties and be a magistrate. And in Wiltshire, he discovered a cabal of witches, 7 or 8 women operating in Wiltshire as witches, and he detected them at Malmesbury, sent them to Salisbury jail, where eventually he had them hung. So Sir James is not really necessarily the sort of person that we would want to have on our dinner table today. But anyway, it's likely the money that would eventually allow Sir Richard to buy Sutton came from the dowry his wife brought with her. And so it's an important sort of understanding that you marry, and you marry well, your political allies, and you do it for gain. You do it for consolidation of the family resources. And so this is a detail. This happens to be a detail of a 17th century map. Sir Richard is a courtier, so he's very keen on making sure that he's in the right place. He's convenient to court, wherever court is, and he would have needed to be close to the royal palaces. Now, at the time of the restoration in 1660, there were really only two functioning royal palaces. That was Whitehall and Hampton Court, both of which had been used by the Cromwellian administration and retained in anything that approached their glory. And Sutton is 12 miles away from Whitehall. It's 9 miles away from Hampton Court, but it's only 3 miles away from Nonsuch. And the trouble is, though, if we think about Nonsuch, is that it had been pretty much trashed by the parliamentary forces, and it had been allowed to decay. And frankly, it was a dump. But something happened in 1665 that made Nonsuch and its surroundings far more interesting, and that was the Great Plague. Different departments of government were moved out of London. The Exchequer, for example, moved to Nonsuch, while the King fled to Oxford. People who were wealthy and powerful wanted to take their families out of London. Of course, the poor would have to stay, and they died. And that's the period where you have the whole plague doctors with the strange beaks and the bring out your dead and the crosses painted on the doors within London. Interestingly, we don't have burial records in Sutton for 1665 because, again, these are problems with the uncertainty of government, uncertainty of the time, but we don't have burial records for Sutton and St Nicholas for 1665. What we do have is burial records for Cheam and Carshalton, and they don't really seem to throw up much evidence that we were, in this part of the world, very much affected by plague hitting us. But, of course, it is the setting where if you are wealthy, if you are a landowner, if you're gentry, you still worry about your family just as much as you and I worry about our family. And Sir Richard and Lady Anne Margaret would have worried about their children. You've got Dorothy Mason, their eldest daughter, who was born in 1664, and you've got Anne, who was born in 1665, the year of the plague. So she was very much born in the plague year. So the sweet air of Banstead Downs would have been very, very attractive to the Mason family, and it would also help, by the way, that Sutton is the site of extensive chalk deposits that make excellent lime, especially in the making of mortar. Now, we don't know where the Mason family were living, but it may well have been in and around the area, as Sir Richard was involved in the logistical side of government. So he helped arrange the comings and goings of different court departments. And he would have been a contemporary of people like Samuel Pepys, who was in charge of victualling. That's the supply of food and drink to the court. So we know that because he needed to move sums of money about, he actually visited Nonsuch pretty regularly, and would have stayed in Ewell and stayed in Cheam, would have stayed in places like that. Now, in 1665, the Great Fire of London did a lot to burn out the plague in the city, and Sutton presented itself then as a huge opportunity. So a massive opportunity, because you're right close to London. So all the villages surrounding London would have seen their trade suddenly go up, because if you're rebuilding London, if you've got to feed people who are coming back into the city, if you've got to provide building supplies, then Sutton would have made money from that. It had large chalk quarries that would have provided the lime for the massive building programmes that had to go on. I think Christopher Wren rebuilt 62 parish churches in London before really 1669. But anyway, in 1669, that's when Sir Richard came to Sutton officially. That's when he bought the manor of Sutton. And he bought bought it from Thomas Weston, who was the Earl of Portland. It had been granted to the Weston family by Charles II after the restoration of the monarchy, and it was the year 1669 actually was the year that Christopher Wren was given permission to rebuild. What you see here in the slide is the old St. Paul's that was burnt down, but to rebuild and create the new St. Paul's. So after 1669, the family, this is the Mason family, lived in Sutton properly. So this is an example of where the lord of the manor buys the manor and then lives in the manor. And this is the place, Sutton is the place that the Mason family called home. And it's important because it's the first time in history that the lord of the manor actually has their principal residence in a place. In the place. So you've got the abbots of Chertsey, who are obviously in Chertsey, and you had the Carews before them, or after them, who lived in Beddington. Beddington really didn't look to the glory of Sutton. That's why you've got a splendid church in Beddington. You've even got all of the different wealthy lords who had sub-manors in Carshalton, so Carshalton Church is really splendid. Sutton was a very tiny little place until really Sir Richard Mason made it his home. And here, if you're going to have a lord of the manor, they're going to have a home that is worthy of their dignity, especially for somebody who's ambitious as Sir Richard Mason. And if you look at this is a portrait of Dorothy, and if you look over her shoulder, you can see some tantalising glimpses of a house. And that's a great house that's peeping over her shoulder. This is another portrait showing Richard's youngest daughter, and this is Anne. And look at the architecture that you can see here. It makes you wonder, did Sutton have a great house that had porticos, like the portico she's sitting in? Did it have a splendid courtyard with fountains? Did it have Baroque decorations? Now, if we did have a house like this in Sutton, then it's completely and utterly lost. Now, the court of Charles II, this is where Richard Mason worked. The court of Charles II would have been complex, it would have been noisy, it would have been confusing. People had to work in it to really bring things to order. And he was an organiser. Sir Richard he was appointed as something called the second clerk controller of the green cloth in June 1671. And that's an odd name, but the clerks of the green cloth served an organisation called the Board of the Green Cloth. This is a committee that looks after the household management of the palace. It's a committee that are responsible for any of the moves that if the court was to move en masse, or a department of the court was to move from, say, Greenwich to Nonsuch, or if it moved from Whitehall to Greenwich, or it moved to Hampton Court, then it would be the Board of the Green Cloth that would do that. So you have to be an organiser, and you also had responsibility for anything that happened in the purview of the court. So they managed the scandals and the crimes and the misdemeanours that took place in the court as well. So you're a fix-it sort of person who works for the Board of the Green Cloth. And unimaginatively, why is it called the Board of the Green Cloth? Because unimaginatively, the board refers to the table, and it's called the Table of the Green Cloth because it had a cloth of green baize on it. Really, I don't think that's a terribly clever name, but obviously, if you're asking who's organising things, that lot who sits at the table with the green tablecloth. Okay. Now, the the salary for a clerk, somebody like Sir Richard Mason, he was paid £500 a year. And on top of that, he actually got lodgings as well. Lodgings, his food, he got fees. On top of that, he got sort of bribes when contracts were signed. And he also had ancient rights of called waste, command and remains, which is basically he could look at everything from the candle stubs through to the food that was remaining from the kitchens. So he had an income of £500. How much is that? Well, £500. He was appointed in 1671, but if we do a comparison to 1670, we could bring that up and say, well, that's the equivalent in 1670 of 7,142 days' labour for a skilled tradesperson. And if you want to know that's about 20 times. His pay was 20 times that of a skilled worker today. That's really, you're thinking senior executive of a FTSE 100 type company there. Now, on a side note, this is a portrait of Charles II's wife. I actually think she's very, very attractive. But this is Catherine of Braganza. She was Portuguese and Roman Catholic. And that made her deeply, deeply unpopular for many people in the country. She wasn't, we call her Catherine, but she wasn't Catherine. She was Caterina. And it's interesting to note that Anne Margaret, Sir Richard's wife, started calling herself Anna Margareta rather than simply Anne Margaret. So I think that she's a bit of an affectation there because of Caterina de Braganza and that you've got Anna Margareta. Pretentious? Moi? But back to Sir Richard himself. So his career continued to develop. He was one of the commissioners of executing the office of the Master of Horse. So that's essentially looking again after administration of military matters and household matters. He's the MP for Yarmouth. He's also that was in 1673, so he picked up again after the next Parliament. He then went to the MP for Bishop's Castle, Shropshire. He didn't have to have anything to do with those places, but simply that was his key into the legislative body, and it was a big, profound way of honouring him. Now, this is the interior of St. Paul's Cathedral. The restoration had put a lid on England's Civil War problems, but it had worked because although Charles II had a Catholic wife and he liked the Baroque and extravagant style of England's Catholic neighbours, he was outwardly conforming to the Protestantism of the Church of England. And that Protestantism was the thing that gave England very much a sense of its prime driver, if you like, of its identity. And we may have fought the Dutch from time to time, but the key threat were the Catholic monarchs of Spain and France. So when Charles II died, this created another crisis for the country. Sir Richard was actually in the room when Charles died. He wasn't alone in the room. There were dozens and dozens of people all surrounding him, watching and witnessing this moment of state as the king died, because they were there to be witnesses and then to be able to acclaim the next king. So Charles died in February of 1685. Now, Sir Richard was going to die the next month. He obviously didn't know that. He hadn't booked that in, but he was going to die then. But in that time, he was able to, at the moment of death, he would have acclaimed James II, Charles's brother, as king. So his wife, Lady Anne, or Anna Margareta, wrote a detailed account of the king's last illness and death in a letter to her mother, who is Lady Dorothy Long at Draycott House in Wiltshire. And that letter actually only came to light in 1850 when it was discovered by Charles Dickens, actually, and published in the newspaper that he managed, which was Household Words. So the Mason family are high Tory. That means they are adherents to the royal family. They believe passionately in the Restoration, that all authority comes from the king, and the king maintains that sense of divine right, and there is that sense of anointing separating the king from everyone else because they have a divine purpose. And the family were able to boast that here you have Sir Richard Mason, who had served both King Charles but also King James now. So he's a servant of two kings. Now, incidentally, the rector of Sutton, the Reverend George Roberts, died also in the February of 1685. So there was having to be a hurried look for a new rector of Sutton. But this chap, James II, his Roman Catholicism really did alienate most of the population. It was Sir Richard's son-in-law. There's a story here which I'll go into more when I'm talking about Anne Mason in two Ramble's time. Her husband got caught up in Monmouth's rebellion and spent time evading capture, really. So you've got, interestingly, you've got the problem of the Monmouth Rebellion, which was when Charles II's illegitimate son, who was Protestant, raised a rebellion in June of 1685, trying to stop the coronation of James II. And Monmouth's forces were finally defeated in Sedgemoor in the July of 1685. It really came to a head because James II had been childless. People were sort of not making too much of a fuss. They were really, really unhappy with him, but they weren't it wasn't a threat because he was old. He was in his 50s. He didn't have kids, and he didn't have kids. He didn't have a son. That's the main thing. He didn't have a son. He had a daughter. He had daughters, and he had Mary. And Mary, his eldest daughter, was Protestant, strongly Protestant, and married to William of Orange, and that looked really good. You know, we're eventually going to get a Protestant queen after him. But when James had a son in 1688, that was the sort of bang, the shot that caused people to go into a state of panicky meltdown. And there's all sorts of conflicts on the continent at the time. And it's very difficult to imagine the hostility of the politics of that period. You had all sorts of persecution of Protestants going on in France. You had all sorts of quasi-religious wars going on as well, jostling between Austria and the German Protestant states, and what was happening with the Dutch as well. But anyway, in 1688, seven senior peers wrote to William of Orange and said, why don't you come over with your wife and basically take over? And so he did. So he brought an army. He managed to scrape together an army very, very quickly. He managed to put them into the one thing that the Dutch were brilliant at was marine transport. So he had a ready built fleet. He brought that over, and he landed in Torbay. And then he marched from the west upwards, and the Lords and Commons offered King Billy, Dutch William, the throne, and he took it. with his wife. He was co-monarchs. Can you have a co-monarchs? Well, they were joint monarchs. Anyway, but the point was, from a Sutton's perspective, priests have always, since the Middle Ages, had to swear an oath of allegiance. That's a promise. And you've got a severe problem here, because if I was to give you the wording that the priests today, so that would have been somebody like the new rector of Sutton, or the new priest in charge of St. Nicholas, had to say, she would have said, I, my name, insert name here, do swear that I will be heirs and successors according to law, so help me God. Now, James II, who's pictured here, may well have been a huge problem. His belief and his character may be in question, and actually he had a reputation. He developed a reputation for cowardice and arrogancy that managed to make him called, in Ireland, he was called Seamus Akaka, which is James the Shit. So it doesn't matter though what the character of the person is. A promise is a promise. And James had been crowned in June 1685. He was an anointed king. And as a condition of office, clergy were required to swear allegiance to the new usurping monarchs. This was William and Mary. Now, they maintained the belief that James had abdicated because, amongst other things, James was a bit stupid. He'd thrown the royal seal into the Thames, and that had been seen by many people as him giving up his authority with England. So they maintained it wasn't right of conquest; it was abdication that brought them to the throne. But you have these people, the priests and many bishops, who really couldn't see that. They had taken an oath and they stuck to it, and they could not swear a new oath to the usurping monarchs. And that was one of them. You've got the rector of Sutton there, Jeremiah Oakley. I've highlighted that, as you can see on the screen. He refused when asked. He had been appointed in the March of 1685. He refused in 1689 to give the oath. And they're called non-jurors, those people who don't swear, so non-juring. It's called a schism within the church, and the people who juro is an oath, so people who didn't swear. And he was about 1 of 2% of the clergy of the Church of England, so that's nearly 340 odd priests or bishops who didn't swear the oath. Jeremiah had made Sutton his home. In the register there are in 1688, you had his daughter was born. Earlier than that, a couple of years earlier than that, actually, his son had been born. He called Richard. In 1689, the year of the oath, you had James and John, who are the sons of. So he had twin sons. Baptized as well. So he's got lots of children. Sutton is his home, and he was forced to give up his living in 1690, and he was replaced by the Reverend William Stevens. William Stevens, we'll come to, is a very different personality, but he had his own problems with authority as well, and it must have been awkward for the family, because there's evidence that they still lived in the parish. Certainly, maybe Jeremiah had to leave, but his family still lived in the parish because there were burials. Phineas, a son of Jeremiah Oakley, was buried in 1694, and in 1697, another son, Samuel, was buried as well. This is very sad because it means that when a revolution takes place, there are always going to be people who are turned upside down, and their lives are turned upside down, and sometimes taking a stand on principle can be extremely costly. Even if you don't agree with their position, you have to admire their preparedness to stick to their guns. Now next week, excuse me. Now, next week I'm going to continue exploring this period of Sutton's history. It's a big area of Sutton history, and I know that I've gone on far too long in this, but I'm going to be looking at Dorothy, the eldest daughter of Sir Richard and Lady Anne Mason. So we'll look at her life. It's a life that, well, they were it girls of the 17th. She and her sister were it girls of the 17th century. They had everything. They had wealth. They had looks. They were society beauties. They were highly desirable young women. And they had very different trajectories in their life. Now, I hope I have informed you. I hope I've entertained you. And I hope I've given you some education. These are all my hopes for these little chats. I think I've come to the end of my ramble. I've gone on far too long, and there's so much content to talk about, and I try to keep it to the 3 sessions. There we are. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the stories. Do comment on what you want to know about and how I can improve these talks. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye. So long, Sutton. Your history.